Very good afternoon. Welcome back. We will proceed to the second part of the session Neighborhood First Enhanced Focus, which is chaired by Ambassador Ranjit Ray, former Ambassador of India to Nepal. I request Ambassador Ray to take over the proceedings. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've had two very interesting sessions in the morning. And what struck me really first and foremost was the very impressive development partnership that India has had over the last few decades. As the RIS said, the figure is 150 billion US dollars. I mean, this is really a very impressive amount. And I think, this is not so well known. It needs to be publicized. But the first question that comes to my mind, and especially since we're celebrating 10 years of the Development Partnership Division, is that we have such a wealth of experience over the last few decades of development partnership. So, isn't it now an appropriate time to have some sort of an independent evaluation, some sort of an impact assessment of all this money that India has spent? I know some years ago the RIS had done a special study. They made an assessment of the small development projects and especially the lessons learned, the problems in implementation, some recommendations in terms of how the project can be improved. And perhaps we should look at some sort of independent evaluation for each of the modalities that we have, whether it is lines of credit, small development projects, grant projects, and such like. And from my experience in Nepal, there were two aspects that came up. One was implementation. There were always some problems in the implementation of projects, and this led to a lot of bickering and sort of negative feedback from Nepal. And we then started, a joint monitoring and review mechanism. In fact, we took a leaf out of, the Prime Minister's Pragati meetings and started a kind of joint Pragati meeting for our development projects in Nepal. And I think this meeting has been very useful. And interestingly, the Nepalese then established a similar mechanism with the Chinese. And I understand in India also we have established similar review and monitoring mechanisms with Bangladesh and some other countries. And the second aspect on our partnership, I think, was the sustainability of the projects. And we have established very important, very large projects. For instance, we have a medical institute in Nepal on the lines of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Now, till such time that we provided them with faculty support, our professors from AIIMS went there and worked and so on. Everything went off well. But after a couple of years, when this faculty support dried up, a lot of problems started happening in that institute. So perhaps here there is something else that when we are formulating these projects, the sustainability of these projects needs to be kept in mind. One other aspect, and we have been talking about neighborhood first policy. Now, this is not only a bilateral policy. There is a very important sub-regional element, sub-regional dimension to this policy. And I think, in Delhi at least, there should be a sub-regional approach because, for instance, we are setting up integrated checkposts along the borders with many of our neighboring countries, and there are 13 in all, I believe. So there would be a lot of commonalities, a lot of similar factor in the implementation of each of these projects. And there are some lessons to be learned from that. So I think the sub-regional dimension is very important. I know in the case of energy, for instance, we have transmission lines between Nepal and India. We have transmission lines between Bhutan and India, between Bangladesh and India. So in effect, we have already created some sort of a sub-regional grid for electricity trade, for power trade. And I think this sub-regional aspect should also be kept in mind when we are talking about our development partnership. Reference was also made to trilateral cooperation. And in some cases, because of the asymmetry in the relationship between India and its neighbors, neighbors find it easier to enter into agreements with India, not necessarily bilaterally, but on a trilateral basis. And a related aspect to this is that, certain projects that we undertake, for instance, hydropower projects, are very, very expensive projects, huge capital investments. long gestation periods. So there is a paucity of resources. So it's important that we get like-minded countries, Japan, Korea, Norway, the US, others, who would also be interested in this kind of, 2+1 cooperation, as they say. So I think we should look at these certain aspects. One last point, and that relates to the role. Development partnership should not only be a partnership between governments. It's very important that this partnership include the private sector and civil society, because the governments can create the infrastructure, they can create the legislative framework within which cooperation is to happen, but the actual cooperation should happen with the private sector. So there should be some mechanism for an interface with the private sector when we are thinking about our development partnership. And the same thing with civil society. And I'll give you one instance. There was this terrible earthquake in Nepal in 2015. So a lot of Indian NGOs came to Nepal wanting to assist Nepal. Then we found out that under our Foreign Exchange Management Act, we cannot transfer money from India abroad. Or NGOs cannot transfer money from India to a foreign country where they want to undertake such projects. So that really stymied. We had some special exceptions made by the Ministry of Finance, one-time exceptions, and some organizations were allowed to take money from India. But this is, we are really hitting ourselves on our knees, because it's very important. And there are certain sensitive areas where it's difficult for the government to be involved, where civil society and NGOs can work. And in a country like Nepal, for instance, there are dozens of Chinese NGOs that are working in Nepal, very, very few, if any, Indian NGOs. So that's the other aspect. So we have a very interesting continuation of the previous session on the neighborhood. And I think we are looking at a very, very impressive and distinguished set of speakers who will speak to us about India's experiences in Bangladesh, in the Maldives, in Afghanistan, in Myanmar. And I hope, apart from telling us about what we are doing, if you can look at it, critically in terms of, can it be done better? Is there something else that we should be doing? Are there certain other modalities that we should be looking at? So, I think that would really contribute to a better understanding and perhaps, impact policy formulation. I can see Nutan on the screen. So, impact policy formulation in India. And the first speaker we have is Dr. Srimanti Sarkar. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the West Bengal State University. And she is going to speak, she specializes on Bangladesh. So over to you, Professor Sarkar.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ray. Thank you for the introduction. And with regards to all my co-panelists and audiences, I would like to begin my presentation right away. Am I audible properly? Okay. Uh, just to begin, I have very simplistically titled my presentation as India Bangladesh Development Partnership in the 21st Century, a critical overview. And by this, I intend to map the development cooperation and development partnership scenario in India and Bangladesh over the last 1 decade in general, and maybe last 5 years in particular. And in order to do so, I have tried to chalk out the points. And so I will divide my presentation in 3 broad subpoints. Maybe in the first segment, I'll slightly, very briefly ponder upon the point, like what do we mean by development partnership and development cooperation, and how it is perhaps an integral part of bilateral relationship. So when I'm reading about development cooperation and partnership, I can see when it is very much an integral part of the Indo-Bangladesh bilateral relations. So this is our first point that I will love to talk about a little briefly. Then in the second section, I wish to discuss about the, the actual ground realities, how development cooperation had actually worked out between India and Bangladesh. I'll try to touch up on the points of development very briefly because it's not possible to do the stock taking so much in this less time. But the third section will be, what are the challenges that I feel are there affecting the development partnership. So I will be mainly focusing the first and maybe the third section a little more in depth, and I'll concise the second aspect with a few reports and literature points from where we can get an update.
Dr. Sarkar, sorry to interrupt. I forgot to say that you have 12 minutes,
Right,
which
right.
means till
I
20.
understand. So first of all, it is important to know what development partnership or development cooperation is all about. So as we all know, just to touch upon it, is basically a sustainable, inclusive, non-conditional, and demand-driven and mutually beneficial development assistance program. That is what development partnership and cooperation is all about. And it is carried out through extension of LOCs, line of credits, and through subsequent management and assessment of development and economic progress in the partner country. That is development partnership is all about. Okay. Now, what is India's approach towards development partnership? It is very important to note. Over the past 1 decade, we have seen that India has grown as an emerging economy in South Asia, and along with growing as an emerging economy in South Asia, it has become an active player in development cooperation, in development partnership. So its partnership has extended to lower income countries across Asia and Africa. And in doing so, its partnership has actually also extended to Bangladesh, its formidable neighbor. Now, the core principle or the ethos of development cooperation that of India is basically Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That is, the world is one family. That is one world philosophy. That is a philosophy which guides India's policy towards development cooperation. And according to this, India aims to adopt a human centric approach towards development, marked by respect, diversity, care for future sustainable development, and so on. Now, if we recall history very briefly, India's development cooperation efforts had begun even before from the time of independence, from her period of independence. Okay, we have seen India had been extending resources, material, intellectual, to countries who were struggling for independence during the time of India's independence. Okay, and today we find a continuation of that effort, development cooperation partnership effort, especially in her neighborhood. And the volume and diversity of India's development cooperation under the broad rubric of South-South cooperation has grown exponentially. That is the approach with which India embarks upon development partnership. Okay. Now, if we go through MEA records, and we can see that the line of credits has increased exceedingly, like it is 22 billion USD, which is like 34% more than what it was during 2017-18. Then in terms of grants and loans, that is aids, it is allocated grant is 78,826 crore, and disbursed grant is over 69,000 crores, and so on and so forth. In case of capacity building, is also the datas are there, which is huge. Basically, I'm cutting the data short over here. Now, what about Bangladesh? What is Bangladesh's approach towards development cooperation? This has been India's approach. Now, Bangladesh is a formidable neighbor and a significant development partner of India, also is a major recipient country of aid from India and as well as from other countries. Now, number 2 point is the relationship between India and Bangladesh is civilizational, deep, with definite socio-historical, cultural, political sides determining their relationship. Third, when Bangladesh emerged as an independent country, it was resource crunched, it was war-raven. So Bangladesh, in the immediate aftermath of independence, was depending heavily upon, grants and aids from India, very importantly. But eventually, what happened, now it is not that dependent upon grant and aid. So there has been a shift. So that needs to be reflected upon. So after independence, her policies were Indo-centric, definitely for obvious reasons. We know the history, okay? But over the period of time, her dependence has diversified and essentially got diffused. So Bangladesh today has reinstated, has reworked her relationship with not only China, but Pakistan, as well as the countries of Middle East. Now it has opened new vistas for development cooperation. It has opened new vistas for development cooperation for Bangladesh. And it is in this slide that we need to look into Indo-Bangladesh development cooperation and partnership. So while Bangladesh today has chalked out its economy in a very significant manner, and it has done really well in terms of economy, so it is in this context that we need to review Indo-Bangladesh development cooperation scenario. That is the point. Okay. So today, for example, Bangladesh had successfully embarked upon, or successfully had graduated in two aspects. That is, it has grown from LIC, low income country, to low middle income country, as well as it has become a developing country from the least developed country. So these are the major economic leaps of Bangladesh. So it is in this context, with major growth in its economy, we find a well-defined development cooperation policy in Bangladesh. That is the National Policy on Development Cooperation. It not only lists out the way it intends to work out or manage development cooperation, but it also lays a roadmap how it is going to very systematically work out with it. So with economic development of Bangladesh, what we can see is, Bangladesh is working out towards, systematically how it wants to develop. So in view of that, it is very important for us to see that how India, it in the wake of growing Bangladesh's economy, has been working, how India wants to review or reframe its development cooperation policy in view of Bangladesh, whose economy is growing very fast. This is the first thing. Then what are the determinants that shape development partnership and development cooperation between India and Bangladesh, and then what is the way ahead? Okay, so with this, I enter into my second section very briefly. In the second section, basically what I want to talk about is that Bangladesh's and India's development cooperation, if we track the route, we can trace it back to 2011. September 2011, where Indian government under Manmohan Singh and Sheikh Hasina government had signed a agreement framework, and where in trade, investment, economic cooperation, river basin management, disaster management, in power sector, educational, cultural sector, environment, regional and sub-regional cooperation, in matters of security and national interest, they have agreed to work together. And if we go through a plethora of literature that has come out over the last 10 years and 5 years, like if we go through Oxfam report, if we go through MEA reports, if we go through publications from CPD Bangladesh, as well as if we go through EXIM bank data, we will see in each and every sector, the development, the collaboration and cooperation between India and Bangladesh has flourished. Okay, ranging from COVID situation collaboration to capacity building, training of police personnel, civil servants, and so on. The development cooperation in the development cooperation sector, collaboration has exceedingly increased. Now, from this, I'm not going into the details. I do have the data, but I'm not going into the details. So with this, what we get is, apparently a win-win situation. That is, India and Bangladesh development cooperation situation is precisely going good. Okay, and it is also maybe clear that India and Bangladesh has overcome their regime incompatibility, or the dynamics, the rhetorical relationship that it had, when both the regimes, the Congress regime and the Awami League regime, they will be more compatible. This kind of rhetoric that we always had. Now, we have even bypassed that. We are now in a situation where, irrespective of whichever political regime, we are doing fine in case of economy and development cooperation and so on and so forth. But what does this mean? Does that mean that there are no contestations Does that mean that, just 2 minutes, Ambassador, if you allow me. So does that mean that there are no areas of contestations? Number one, areas of contestations are there. If we go get into the minute details of the each and every development cooperation schemes, then we can find the local problems and the policy details, the incompatibilities which needs to be worked out. But in a broader scale, I trace three major problems. That is, historical, cultural, economic linkage between India and Bangladesh are prolific and continuous, and we mostly harp on them. Okay, we harp on the historical civilizational relationship between India and Bangladesh when it comes to development, cooperation, growth, and so on and so forth. My point is that this kind of a heuristic, this kind of putting value on heuristic relationship growth is not going to do so well, especially with in view of the fact that Bangladesh's economy has changed. We need to take a very practical formula. We need to take a very practical stand in this regard, because harping on the historical civilizational connection is good, but that might not be exclusively good, might not be very practical if we harp on that exclusively. If we rely our faith on the fact that the relationship is that of a very integral one just because of a civilizational tie, it might be somewhat faulty. That is my first point. The next point is that the neighborhood relationship, we need to be watchful about the small state syndrome. Okay, now small state syndrome is very easy to understand, but I want to just draw your attention to this very minutely a little bit more. Now, the irony of our neighborhood first focus policy is that we are harping on neighborhood first policy, but by harping on neighborhood first policy, India is actually aspiring for great power position. Okay, and in order to harp on great power position, we are harping on neighborhood first policy as a first step towards achieving great power position.
Sorry to interrupt, but you'll
Yeah.
have to wind up now.
Yeah, winding up. So basically, this is a very spiraling situation. So if India has to be watchful, India has to really take in note of the small power tendency, small power syndrome of our neighbors, because that pits India along China and Pakistan and other powerful neighbors in the region. And last point is that neighborhood as a space needs to be very carefully worked out. I do not have time, but neighborhood as a space is caught between state and people. Neighborliness in international relations is a pragmatic zone. Neighbor is defined, is geographically given to you, but that neighborliness is a pragmatic space. Neighborliness, the relationship is determined, is based upon contingent convergent national interests. So in case of India and Bangladesh, if we need to have a continuous development cooperation and partnerships scenario, we need to be watchful about these broader parameters. Neighborhood as a space we need to look into. We need to deal with the small state syndrome very tactically. We cannot avoid that, but we have to work on that. While managing the minute projects, we need to keep that in mind. And last but not the least, we need to come out of that heuristic expected idea that India Bangladesh relationship is civilization. We have to be more pragmatic. I think that is my brief take on this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sarkar. That was a fascinating presentation. Many takeaways, but we don't have so much time, so I'll summarize at the end. And we
Thank
now
you.
move to Dr. Angshuman Choudhury. He's the Senior Research Associate at the Center for Policy Research. And he's also, prolific writer, writes regularly for Indian and international newspapers, and also sits on various NGOs. And he's going to talk about Myanmar, and especially with all these political changes in Myanmar, how that impacts India's entire development partnership program in that area and the whole region, if I may say. Dr. Chaudhary.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for your remarks at the beginning. I think you have set the context very well. I'm just to clarify, I'm not a doctor. It's not yet. But I actually sent a presentation to Dr. Bhattacharjee. I don't know, it's basically a two-slide presentation. If that could be displayed, basically something that I wanted to show while I speak, uh, other than that session, or is it possible for me to share?
Just a minute. We are sharing the presentation.
Okay.
Meanwhile, could you start perhaps, while this
Yeah,
is being
sure,
done?
sure. Makes sense. Um, so I'm largely going to focus on Myanmar in my remarks, and Professor Sarkar has already given a lowdown on essentially what India's approach to developmental aid is. So I'm going to keep my presentation specifically focused on what we have done in Myanmar. Uh, Now, for India, Myanmar is a very crucial partner in the neighborhood. What is noteworthy is that Myanmar sits at the intersection of two of our neighborhood policies, which is the neighborhood first policy, of course, and the Act East policy. So that actually gives Myanmar a very unique value to India's developmental aid cooperation in the neighborhood because of the sort of strategic sweet spot in which Myanmar sits. Um, Now, there's an intricate set of interests and concerns that drive India's developmental approach, or rather India's foreign policy towards Myanmar. And if I have to lay my finger on something, there would be three aspects, which are the border, the more than 1,600-kilometer long border that we share with Myanmar, which makes Myanmar a very strategically important country, and also in the sense of security. Number two, Myanmar becomes our gateway to Southeast Asia. In simple words, Act East cannot function without Myanmar. Myanmar is that critical piece to the Act East puzzle. Number three, China. For China, also much like India, Myanmar is an important part of the Southeast Asian puzzle, right? So it is the Chinese influence that sort of growing, in fact, rapidly growing Chinese influence that makes Myanmar cooperation with Myanmar very important for India. Now, essentially, the reason why I'm showing this graph, this is based on my sort of essentially the figures published by the Ministry of External Affairs in terms of the grant aid, budgetary grant aid that India has provided to Myanmar over the last few decades, and I've collected the data for only the last 1 decade. Now, the reason why that is so is that the last 1 decade was especially crucial for Myanmar. As all of you must already know, Myanmar underwent a very, very critical phase of democratic transition starting 2010. And that is something, and I will come to this later, the transition has practically ended now and very tragically ended, so to say, but I'll come to that later. But the last decade was very crucial for Myanmar. There's a rapid opening up of the developmental space, rapid opening up, dramatic opening up of the foreign investment space. And India very quickly and promptly and swiftly, I would say, capitalized on that new energy, which the democratic transition created. Now, as I said, the reason why I'm showing this graph is to tell you that India's developmental assistance to Myanmar, developmental approach to Myanmar, if there's one word that I would describe over the last one, that would be resilient. It has been resilient, and why I say that or why I argue that is because it has weathered some very tectonic political transformations and changes of government in both India and Myanmar. Right. In fact, we see that the average aid, allocated aid, and rather, in fact, the disbursed aid in actual spending has increased over the last decade with the coming of a new quasi-civilian government led by Thein Sein in 2011 in Myanmar, then the change of government in New Delhi, the coming of the Narendra Modi government in India in 2014, then the coming of the Aung San Suu Kyi government in Ecuador in 2015, 2016 rather, when she took charge. Then the Rohingya crisis, very tumultuous period of the Rohingya crisis, which actually began in 2017 but lingered on for at least 1.5 years. And why I would include 1.5 years is because I count the serious international response, the sanctions as part of that entire crisis spectrum. Then, of course, in 2021 we saw the coup happening, right? But as the graph shows, the actual disbursed spending, even during the coup year, has been one of the highest, right? the allocated spending has also not gone down. So, generally speaking, our development assistance, the quantum of development assistance that India has provided to Myanmar has steadily increased over the last decade, which is a very positive, sort of indication. Now, I've written this in my writings, and I've argued that Myanmar at least was one of India's success stories, primary success stories when it comes to development cooperation. Because as I said, India was very swift to capitalize on the opening of the space. And on the part of Myanmar also, Myanmar looked to India for development cooperation to diversify its own sort of set of partners in the neighborhood, and also to a very large extent to offset dependence on China. They didn't want to be so over reliant on Chinese aid, and that's where they saw India as a crucial, as an alternative development partner. Now, there are several challenges that we face, but again, I'm going to come to that later. But my bigger point here is that there was a congruence of geopolitical interests and appetite for development cooperation from both ends, which was capitalized very well. Now, the second reason why I say it was a success story is because the, India's development cooperation approach in Myanmar has certain elements which I believe can become bigger models for us to emulate in other regions, including the broader ASEAN region, specifically the CLMV region, and also sort of in distant neighborhoods, for instance, the African continent. Right? Uh, Let me be more specific. India has something called the BADP, or Border Area Development Projects, along the India-Myanmar border inside Burmese territory, particularly in the Naga self-autonomous zone, in the Naga self-administered zone. I think the BADPs can be a very effective model to ensure people-centric development in remote regions, which India can, I think, emulate in the CLMV region. And India is actually planning to do that, which is a good thing. The second thing is, again, flowing from this, that uh, one of the key aspects of India's development cooperation in Myanmar is that it has been very, very people-centric, which is not the case with Chinese projects. The Chinese always focus on big ticket projects, big economic corridors, big highways, special economic zones, and the rest, right? I'm not saying we don't have a focus on that or we don't want to focus on that, but Indian projects in Myanmar have, focused on sectors which are extremely people-centric and build bottom-up capacity, right? Such as public health, higher education, agriculture, vocational training, information technology, etc. Right, and the border area projects, as I said, right. Now, having said this, I personally believe that for India, the crucial sort of central position aspect in its sort of development assistance to Myanmar is connectivity, right? And that is for an obvious reason. The strategic position that Myanmar sits at, and the gateway to the Southeast Asia that it becomes, hence, gives Myanmar a very, lends Myanmar very unique or indispensable to India's regional connectivity projects or regional connectivity vision, right? Hence, we have something like the Kaladan project. It's an entirely different story that the project hasn't been completed yet since it was officially commissioned around 2008. But those are things, there are issues and challenges that are there. But generally, Kaladan project, then the India-Myanmar trilateral project, then the Re-Tidin Road. So you see, we have some very ambitious connectivity projects that we want Myanmar to be a part of, right? So connectivity really, is a central thrust in this entire spectrum, right? Um, Now, what is interesting to note here is that I'll just quickly, give some figures based on the graph that you are seeing here, which is that so far, the total worth of development projects that India has executed in Myanmar is 1.7 billion US dollars, right? Which is not insignificant. The last fiscal year that you see, which is 2021, 2022, we allocated 400 crore, but actually ended up spending more. We have spent around rupees 598.25 crores, and these are figures from the MEA dashboard, right? We have already dispersed that despite the coup. The previous year we allocated 300 crore, and again ended up spending slightly more, which is 347 crore. In terms of the lines of credit, also India has given some very heavy lines of credit. In 2012, India extended a 500 million US dollars line of credit. Then in 2015, we extended a 198 million US dollar line of credit. So we have seen that the Exim has stepped in also to fund projects through the LOC route, right? Um, so in that sense, India has has had a very good portfolio, strong portfolio in terms of investments. Now, quickly coming to the challenges that or the shortcomings that India faces in its sort of development cooperation in Myanmar. Uh, I will go to the post-coup period slightly in let's say 1 to 2 minutes. But before that, one of the key sort of issues that we were facing is sustaining our projects. We have a challenge. We have a serious challenge in ensuring sustained delivery capacity. We have a challenge in sustaining funding, and also on other issues. For instance, land acquisition. Right, we want to build a highway, but we are not able to acquire land because of complex legalities inside Myanmar and also our border states. Right now, there is related to this is the fact that when this happens, when the delays happen, there is an inflation, overinflation of costs. For example, take the Kaladan project. The Kaladan project's budget, and I'm not exaggerating. Kaladan project's budget in 2008 was around 536 crore. Today, in the current day, it's rupees 3,200 crore. This is dramatic increase in project cost. So it's become difficult for us to, actually implement the projects that we have promised, right? So those I think things need to be looked at. The other thing is that there's the Chinese have actually been putting in a great deal of money in Myanmar, right? Including within the Belt and Road BRI framework. Now they have something called the CMEC, which is China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, right? And the Chinese have significantly higher. This is a raw truth that I'm pretty sure many honest analysts would agree with. China has demonstrated significantly higher delivery and funding capacity than India when it comes to Myanmar, right? This is a problem for India because it saturates the development market, right? If the Chinese end up building all the projects, what will India contribute to, right? So this is something that India has to talk about. That is why I say the border area development projects and people-centric projects are very important because it compensates for the areas which the Chinese projects don't touch, right? Now, quickly coming, if you could please shift to the next slide, which is the only other slide. Yeah. So basically, this is the map that you need to see. This is the only map that you need to see and understand to be able to comprehend what is the very, very serious challenge that India faces in the post-coup context when it comes to development cooperation, right? Many Indian projects, in fact, the crown jewels of Indian projects in Myanmar are focused on this area: the Chin State, Northern Rakhine State, Southern Chin State, Northern Rakhine border, Mizoram, Southern Mizoram, this area, right? As far as this is concerned, on the Myanmar side, this area has become a conflict hotspot in the post-war context. We have seen, in fact, Chin State, one of the highest number of PDFs, or People's Defense Forces, a coalition of PDFs, and also the ethnic armed organization, which is called the CNA, or Chin National Army, are concentrated in Chin State, right? So this area is very, very politically unstable. The Arakan Army, which largely operates in Rakhine State, is also operating in southern Chin State around Palitwa. One of the key roads or key parts of the Kaladan project is from Palitwa to Kalitwa, right? Now, given this extreme insecurity on the ground, I think it becomes very difficult for India to actually go ahead with the projects. So the Kaladan project is once again hanging in a limbo because of this. Even if we give contracts, which India has already given a contract to a company called IRCON to build that last leg of the road from Palitwa, even if we have the contracts in place, engineers actually don't want to go and work because their fear is natural. They might be kidnapped, they might be killed, right? So this ground level insecurity is is a very, very serious challenge for Myanmar. And this is my last point. I've crossed 12 minutes. This is my last point, which is that India really needs to understand that as far as development cooperation is concerned, the goodwill of the people in Myanmar is extremely important. It isn't just about government to government goodwill. It isn't just about sort of state-centric cooperation, right? And this is something that Ambassador Ray mentioned earlier. The intervention of private lobbies and civil society is extremely important. Now, if India is seen to be giving or putting in money that that goes through junta-linked entities, or that goes to the junta, that India's public diplomacy narrative in Myanmar suffers really badly. I track Burmese Twitter very closely, and there are serious concerns about India's position in Myanmar. So I think India should capitalize on the fact that it already has people-centric projects and focus on the fact that it needs the goodwill of the people if it wants to expand and sustain its development cooperation in Myanmar. This is particularly so because the Chinese are not very popular in Myanmar. India still has much goodwill in Myanmar. We don't want to lose that. So I think this challenges are very complex and there are no easy answers given the situation in Myanmar. But I think India has a great head start, and India can definitely instrumentalize that in the years to come. but it has to be diplomatically agile and context sensitive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Angshuman, for a very interesting presentation. And of course, I had one question. Looking at the map, I mean, can't we just go from through Bangladesh to Aizawl instead of this very complicated route that we've taken? But that's maybe perhaps for the discussion at some stage. Now, I move to our next speaker, Dr. N. Manoharan, Associate Professor at the Christ University in Bengaluru. And earlier he was working with the National Security Council Secretariat, and he's going to talk about the Maldives. And it's a country with which we have seen a seesaw in our relationship. The India-Maldives relationship, the Maldives-China relationship, and I wonder how all this has impacted on our development cooperation. So over to you, Dr. Manoharan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, respected chairperson, my fellow panelists, and distinguished audience. At the outset, I must appreciate ICWA for putting things together, because very few institutions look at this. So especially I must appreciate DG, Joint Secretary Dr. Nutan, Dr. Nivedita Ray, and Dr. Dhruv Jyoti, who is actually coordinating this. Once again, my appreciations. I quickly move into this. I've been tasked to look at Maldives. That's why I put this as there are promises and there are possibilities. What is on the ground? So thank you, Chair, for pointing out that we need to be critical. Of course, we have to be critical. That's our actually work as academics. There are only four things I want to talk about. First is the context, because in what context this development, whatever this partnership has to be looked at as far as Maldives are concerned. I am not going to get into the generic points which were well addressed by my previous speakers, especially speakers from MEA. There are five contexts I wanted to lay out. First is the political context, where in Maldives, there is actually, as far as development partnership is concerned, there is lack of consensus among the political actors, maybe because of their internal political rivalries. So this has to be kept in mind when we are talking about development partnership with Maldives. Second is the strategic context. We all know the Maldives is the smallest state or one of the smallest states in the world, especially when it comes to South Asia. And it has, I think my previous speaker talked about small state syndrome. This also needs to be taken note, and how the extra regional powers are taking into consideration the strategic location of Maldives, how that messes up, or it is both a possibility and a liability. So that also has to be looked at as a context. Then the third context, which is very important because the entire development partnership revolves around the economic context. We all know that Maldives is the most economically developed country in South Asia, but at the same time, it is a middle income country. Perhaps we need to see whether it will get into a middle income trap. So that is something we need to see. But in terms of the development, as far as development is concerned, it's very skewed, because 80% of its GDP comes from the tertiary sector, which is the services sector. Out of that, tourism is predominantly plays a role. So that is very skewed, because it is very externally oriented because of pandemic, because of external economic shocks. This is something needs to be kept in mind. And also, this is very kind of important point, where its human development index is high, its economic growth is fine, but at the same time, its unemployment is around 30%, which is very concerning. So this context also needs to be kept in mind. Then we have environment context, where suppose if we have to have the same conference 100 years down the line, I'm not even sure whether we will have a session on Maldives. So that is what the concern is. So there is an uncertainty, and of course there are also development opportunities in terms of this environment context. And then you have what is known as security context, which I divide into two. Internal security context, where, because this is very important in terms of how we pitch development partnership assistance to Maldives, how increase in radicalization of late we have found and how many of these Maldives in hundreds are there or were there working with ISIS. This is something very concerning, Islamic radicalization. And also Maldives, because of its location, how it is so vulnerable for piracies and also the external players. So these are the 5 contexts we need to actually keep in mind before talking about development partnership. So now quickly, I don't want to go into details about it quickly, what is happening as far as development partnership is concerned. So this is very important. Unlike other countries of South Asia, we are considered or we consider as net security provider of Maldives in every context. Here, security is seen in a very comprehensive manner. But usually this is also seen, this point about the proximity, how our neighbors see India. It's called as PANGs. But if you look at some of the incidents, I have highlighted here 4 major incidents. In all these incidents, how proximity has actually helped Maldives to get Indian help as soon as possible. Things like even getting water, drinking water. So this is where we differ unlike Chinese. So this is something we need to actually tap on. And then you have what is known as the compatibility. What Maldivians are looking at the comprehensive, the development partnership and how we are looking at. There is a compatibility. We see it as a comprehensive one, and they also have something known as National Framework for Development, something like their own 5-year plans. So there is a compatibility as far as development partnership is concerned. Now, quickly, let me display certain areas. I will just project this so that morning Professor Sachin Sadirveji was talking about the 5 elements or 5 pillars. So there are these areas fit under those 5 pillars. First is in terms of how we comprehensively assist financially Maldives in every manner. I need not to go into details, it's all available here. But the second point is very important, where somewhere we need to take note of how some of our institutions, including banks, the public sector banks, how they are helping. This is something we can tap on, helping in developing certain infrastructures out of the government development partnership assistance. How this is being done also should be taken note of. And this is very important how India is doing. Major chunk of this goes to this infrastructure and connectivity. Like you can see in the image that I have projected, this is called as Greater Maldives Connectivity Project. This is coming out really well. How we are doing in a comprehensive manner, including bridges, roads, causeways, how to connect remotely situated islands to the capital and so on and so forth. That also helps in terms of the population migration, because Malay is too tight, too much of crowded, how population, something like we have satellite cities. This is going to help in terms of this particular project. And we all know 25% of doctors, 25% of teachers of Maldives are Indians. So how we are actually developing their health infrastructure. This is also development partnership involves. And this is also important in terms of HRD, where our development assistant takes care. And energy, this is something like small things you can see. Because of paucity of time, I can't go inside. Something like even street lights, bulbs, this many thousands also we are giving. So which means we are very mindful of what is happening in our neighborhood. That is much appreciable. And somewhere I think this also has come in. I think this was touched in the morning session also, how the community development is so important. And this is important in terms of the radicalization context, where how we are actually building in our development partnership, the rehabilitation, some of the rehabilitations, which actually bails out or which actually looks at the youth or the younger generation. This is also very important and unique to India's development partnership. And then I put it as miscellaneous, the 8th one, the 8th aspect of the development partnership, in terms of how we look at the this also touch I gave the environment context, where it touches those issues that surrounds environment. So this is the scope of development partnership as far as India's relation in terms of development partnership with Maldives are concerned. Now let me move to the third aspect of, these are not without challenges. You can see here First challenge in terms of the economic disparity. When you look at the Gini coefficient, it talks about economic disparity, where Maldives has figures high in terms of Gini coefficiency because of the high economic disparity. As a result, you all can see how in terms of how the relative deprivation sets in and how radicalization also pushed. So this also needs to be addressed in, or it poses as a challenge as far as development partnership is concerned. And then this is very important, where when we look at closely Maldives, its institutions are developing. Its democracy is very new. And as a result, its democratic institutions are developing. Even today, we are not sure how long the present government as a democracy will survive. So it's always about the judiciary getting onto legislature, legislature getting onto executive, and this is how it goes around as a roller coaster. So this is also some posed as a challenge. And then there is also serious issue about lack of consensus as far as India's role is concerned. You can see here, as far as image is concerned, this goes on by the previous government. Even today it goes on. And the present government talks about India first. So this kind of the bipolarity continues, and this is also a challenge. And then we also have as a challenge of extra regional powers. I don't want to name, we all know, it's very obvious how they are also meddling in terms of our development partnership. And then we have, this is very serious, where the previous speakers also talked about in terms of the role for think tanks or academia or university or educational institutions or within the government, how we need to enhance the nuanced understanding, which is not present. That is where sometimes we are not laying eggs in the right basket as far as development partnership in Maldives are concerned. So this is also a fifth challenge. So with that, I'll move to the final one, the way forward. Here I may sound a little bit critical, but that is what we have to do. It's our duty. So first thing that we need to do is to actually try and enhance the Maldivians' growth sectors. As I said, 80% of that goes from the services sector. We need to actually try and help Maldives through development partnership, other two sectors, secondary and primary sectors, which is a possibility. We can discuss that over Q&A. And second is, this also came in the morning, where I fully agree, where how we should develop the human capacity or the local capacity building, because sometimes the local Maldivians feel that the outsiders are taking more of the jobs and we don't have any role. Suppose if we build capacity and hand them over whatever the development partnership projects, I think that will help better. And this is very important, where as I pointed out earlier, because of the scattered nature of the settlements, if all are connected properly, then I think whatever the Maldives, the development in terms of economy or environment could be better. And then the public-private partnership, somebody touched on this. This I think we need to seriously look at. Development partnership should not be looked at only government, whole of government approach. It should actually, government perhaps may think how one can take or rope in the private sector, PPP model, something like that we can always try and look at. And then this off late we are working in terms of the local councils. We have started it, but I think we can actually enhance the involvement of local council. Something like our Panchayati Raj, they have local councils. How to involve them is very important. And statistics shows that when we involve local councils through these development projects, it will work better. This is what last time our external affairs minister was there. When we signed 7 MOUs, they were actually looking at some of the projects where looked at only the government, the community development projects, and they were called as high impact projects because they were very, very impactful. And that is what I'm quoting here, external affairs minister's neighborhood first in action. This is how it is. But the problem here is the follow-ups.
Could I ask you to wind up, Dr.
Yes,
Manoharan, please?
that's it. 30 seconds. So what we are perhaps have to do more is in terms of follow-ups. This applies to every project. Follow-up, somewhere we start a project and we don't follow up. So I stop here. Perhaps we can take during Q&A. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. We now move to Dr. Shanthie Mariet de Souza. She is the founder and president of Mantraya and a visiting fellow at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Germany, in Berlin. She is going to talk to us about Afghanistan. Over to you.
And a privilege to be here today to talk on a very important topic. And I'm just joining the ongoing discussions on development assistance. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, Ambassador Ray, when we're looking at aid, I think we need to look at it a little critically, just not because India has done tremendously well in Afghanistan, but also the fact that what is aid supposed to achieve in a country, especially a country like Afghanistan, which has been going through cycles of conflicts right from the 1970s. So when you look at aid and assistance given by India, particularly when you look at the development partnership, which is rightly framed because we are not like the Western donors who have conditions, who lay out certain conditions in terms of how the aid is used. India actually gives a lot of aid unconditionally, and thereby it has been able to build on the goodwill, both among the elite and also among the people in the country. So Afghanistan was one classic case study in the last 2 decades where the rest of the international community floundered in terms of how the aid was given. India did tremendously well, and we've seen those reports. But our job here and my job here is not just to look at the good part of it, but also about the problems India experienced in the 2 decades and now with the dramatic takeover of Kabul in August by Taliban in August 2021. So when you're looking at aid and you look at it critically, you have to look at the objectives. What was the objectives of India's aid giving in Afghanistan? One, it was directed in terms of the security framework, that is to prevent the anti-India groups fighting base there. And Taliban was seen as one of those groups which was not very friendly to India. So maintaining a pro-India regime there was very important. And thereby, whatever India did in the last 2 decades was directed at the fact that we maintain a certain amount of regime which is pro-democracy and pro-India. And thereby, whatever India did in terms of the sky development projects, including building the parliament, was aimed at that. The second was in terms of looking at the economic dimension of it. Now, Afghanistan had its own reserves, and in terms of the minerals, it had huge potential of developing into a classic case of uh, conflict-ridden country transforming itself and having its own revenues. And thereby, India did take many steps, including having a summit in 2012, the Delhi Investment Summit, which I think was a good step. Now, when you look at the objectives and also look at the outcomes of what is achieved, it did contribute to the Afghanistan's development indices. There were many positive indicators which came out in the last 2 decades. But my critique of the policy has been it had been fragile. And I see it because I've seen the work done there. It's been good in terms of the goodwill it has accrued. But in terms of sustainability of the projects, that's when I think we ran into little issues. And what we did here in Afghanistan, particularly Indian intervention at different points of time, both in terms of the large scale projects and the small development projects, was that most of these projects were given to the Afghans. Now, when you look at Afghanistan, it's not that Afghans didn't have the capacity to do things themselves, but then there was no accountability as such. Now, if you ask me if in a conflict situation, it's very difficult to get into the details of how the money is spent. But there's some projects which ended up as ghost projects, and thereby the sustainability question, which you have rightly raised, leads us to the fundamental fact that do we give money because we need the goodwill, or do we give money because we want to sustain these projects over time? So if you look at it bilaterally, I think the relationship between India and Afghanistan worked very well, despite the fact there were little hiccups here and there in terms of the electoral fraud and the kind of governments Afghanistan was throwing up. But India unconditionally supported the Afghan government because all of that aid and investment was directed at strengthening the Afghan regime, however imperfect it was. And here my critique is that the fact that we didn't actually put points where we could have had certain leverages or influence in the Afghan political system turned out to be counterproductive, especially when the Taliban took power in August 2021. So our argument is that we don't promote democracy, but we need to protect democracy is what I would say. Now, the second aspect is when you look at the peace negotiations which was occurring between the United States and Taliban, and right from 2014, when there were signals that Americans are going to leave, no one really believed it. So most of the international community, including India, functioned under the US security umbrella. And the whole idea of having peace talks with the Taliban and not negotiating from a position of strength and not actually strengthening the Afghan government's position vis-a-vis the peace negotiations turned out to be counterproductive, just not to India but also to the Afghans. And today we see a humanitarian crisis playing out in various ways. You see a political stalemate playing out in ways in which there are armed resistance groups and other groups which are raising opposition voices. So there is a lot of political instability, there is a humanitarian crisis, and there is a dire security crisis in that country where there are groups linked to the Taliban. Al-Qaeda maintains its linkages with the Taliban. The Islamic State has its presence there. It's growing in many ways. And this instability is something that India cannot ignore at this point of time. So my question is fundamentally, in the interest of time, if you have to look at how do you engage Afghanistan now, how do we do it? The fact that the Taliban is there and is sending signals to India to engage at various levels, can it be taken seriously? If India wants to engage with the Taliban, what are the conditions under which India would engage Taliban? Because any unconditional engagement with Taliban would only strengthen that regime. And the fact that the Taliban captured which came in through the peace deal, uh, it signed with the United States, and the fact that they wanted security and they didn't want a civil war situation, actually led to a situation where India did have that leverages with the Taliban. But today, if we have to engage, be it in terms of humanitarian assistance, which India is trying to provide by giving aid through various international organizations or medical supplies or any kind of assistance, has to be based on conditions. I think we need to move from that fact that aid giving without conditions will be problematic in the long term. So if you need to engage the Taliban because they are the de facto leaders, we have to certainly lay certain conditions, and those conditions have to be based on how it makes an impact for the people on the ground in Afghanistan. Now, if you look at what the policy comes today in terms of looking at what happened in 2001, I think it's come a full circle. We started with humanitarian assistance and we moved on, did large scale, high visibility projects, and then there were the small development projects and all of that. So there are certain areas where India can focus on, and I think one of the areas where India looks at is to broad base its engagement. In addition to engaging with the Taliban, the other groups, there are groups, youth groups, the women's groups, the civil society organization, and here and again, I think the point that we look only in terms of governmental engagement, right? And I think Ambassador Ray made that valid point. I think we need to look beyond that prism and look at other areas where India can make that difference. You have areas like the scholarship where the Afghan students need to come, whether we can work on that, whether we can build on capacity building, the ITEC projects which have worked pretty well, whether this can be sustained and built upon. So I think on the bilateral level, we need to look at this. The second is on the economic, and here again, I would like to link it with the regional connectivity projects. The Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline was one of the key areas where India was very much interested in investing in Afghanistan's status as a land bridge. And I think here again there's a possibility that India takes up these issues and looks at ways of engaging the neighborhood, which is the region particularly, because this is one area which would benefit just not the Afghans but also the region. And since there would be certain stakes involved in terms of the benefits it would accrue to the region, there could be a certain amount of mutually dependent framework of cooperation evolving out of that. This other project, I think, again, is the Chabar project, which has been on and off because of various reasons. But here again, I think beyond the bilateral, looking at trilateral framework would be very important. And this again would give option for Afghans to look at areas where they could look at having trade and transit and connectivity minus Pakistan, because Pakistan has been problematic in lot many terms. Uh, Other frameworks obviously exist in terms of the regional framework. If you look at SCO, and again, I think that's again a very important organization given the fact that China has states in Afghanistan and has increased its presence. whether instability will hurt China and whether it will look at working with India or India could work through the SCO framework is something to ponder about. And lastly, when you look at the global cooperation which is occurring at the moment, there's a general sense of fatigue and there's a general sense of policy paralysis of what do we do with Afghanistan. But there are a lot of international organizations, and one of them is the UN. Uh, Again, with the UN, when you look at the Security Council, we don't progress in terms of what we can achieve in Afghanistan, but there are organizations like the UNHCR, the World Food Programs, and other kinds of international organizations. Whether India can work through this and see that what India provides through this organization can translate into some changes on the ground in Afghanistan. Now, when I'm talking about changes, I'm not talking about just engaging the Taliban, it's beyond that. It's looking at a political future where there is a certain amount of inclusion, and we are talking about an inclusive government here. What has been thrust on the Afghans today is completely illegitimate government. The Afghans do not accept it across the country. They did accept it at that point of time because they had no option. But today, you do see pockets of resistance and voices being raised at various platforms. And I think India has to work with this kind of a broad-based engagement. It didn't do in the past 2 decades for various reasons, but now onwards and moving forward, if India has to provide aid and assistance to a country which is conflict-ridden and taken over by a terrorist organization, India has to be very careful in terms of how it crafts its engagement strategy. So I think in the interest of time, I'd like to stop here. I'd like to take Q&A, question answers if there are any. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. D'Souza. And I think we have 4 minutes, so I don't know, Dhrupjyoti, if there are any questions to the panelists.
Yes, sir. We can have 10 minutes for the question answer. And
Okay,
I have, in my private message, like there are some questions that can be asked. Should I read out the questions, sir?
But and if they could be directed to the panelists concerned. Maybe you can read them out, and then the panelists can be given a chance to answer.
Yes, sir. So there are two questions on Bangladesh. The first one is, what are the challenges in opening up Chittagong port as a gateway in connecting India's northeast with the Bay of Bengal? And one other question is, like the port of Ashuganj has in the past been used as a sea river land connectivity route to the northeast from the rest of India. What are the obstructs in its frequent use? There is a generic question like, have countries in the neighborhood publicly acknowledged India as a trusted and a reliable partner with developmental partnership? One more question is on Myanmar. What are the main challenges in India's development strategy for Myanmar after the February 2021 coup? And in the light of the current dispensation in Afghanistan, what are the possible areas that India can cooperate on humanitarian assistance in addition to the wheat and medical supplies of the recent past? So these are the 5 questions which I have.
So thank you very much. Can we start with Professor Sarkar on the Bangladesh questions?
I would just like to request Dr. Dhrupjyoti to repeat the first 2 questions.
Sure. What are the challenges in opening up Chittagong port as a gateway in connecting India's northeast with the Bay of Bengal? And the second question is, port of Ashuganj has in the past been used as a sea river land connectivity route to the northeast from the rest of India. But what are the obstructs in its frequent usage?
Dr. Sarkar?
Um, just I need to clarify
Okay,
as
so
well, like
then can we
Angshuman,
go
that
to
I will
Angshuman
repeat.
on the question on Myanmar? Angshuman?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, thanks for the question. I think the main challenges that we face in Myanmar after the coup, I would just summarize in 2 words, which is 2 terms actually, which is political instability and escalation in armed conflict. This, I think, especially along the border regions, the map that I showed. So this, I think, is the main sort of Achilles heel for India in terms of its developmental projects in Myanmar. There's just too much unpredictability, uncertainty, and volatility on the ground for India to sort of, continue its projects. And as I said, there are practical difficulties. For instance, you may have the contracts in place, but people might not be able to, civil engineers and actual workers might not be willing to go to the border regions, the more sensitive areas, to work, especially after the coup, right? The other issue, the main issue is keeping the junta as a developmental partner, right? I don't think that's going to float very well with the Myanmar people. And when I say people, I just don't mean the people in general, but also the civilian political class, or in this case, the NUG, which is the parallel civilian government, national unity government. The NUG foreign minister, in her interviews given, one of which was to me when I was at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, has been very, very critical of India's sort of passive diplomacy in Myanmar and not taking a harder stance. So there is already a sense of discomfort over India's quote-unquote neutrality in Myanmar. Now, if India maintains the junta as a partner in development, routes its developmental cooperation through the junta-controlled ministries, then India's public diplomacy narrative, which is it has meticulously built over the last 10 years, might suffer gravely. And in this particular case, I think the oil and gas sector is also very important. The MOJ, which is MOG, which is the oil and gas agency, government oil and gas agency in Myanmar, which is now completely controlled by the junta. I think that becomes a good example of what serious controversies in India can land up in if it routes its cooperation through agencies like that. There have been some high-profile exits in the ONG sector from Myanmar, Chevron, Total. So in such a case, I think this is reflective of the broader sort of dilemma that India is at the moment in terms of routing its development aid through the junta. So I think these are the two challenges.
Very difficult choices in
Very.
Myanmar and Afghanistan as well. Dr. D'Souza, would you like to take the question on Afghanistan?
Yes, please. Thank you. I think when you're looking at engagement with Taliban in Afghanistan, it has to be definitely beyond the humanitarian, because we are now responding to a crisis. But we need to have a medium to long-term strategy of what the engagement should actually achieve. And I think we don't do that stock-taking exercise when we get involved in quick reaction responses. So when you look at how the aid can be delivered, I think it should be delivered through the Afghan groups which are existing there at this point of time, and build on the pressure on Taliban to engage on our terms. And that I'm saying not out of fantasy, but the fact that there are divisions within the Taliban. There is the moderate and the hardline faction. And we do see various statements coming out from the Taliban moderate leadership, including being amenable to military training in India. So I think we need to capitalize on this kind of opportunities and see how much we can engage with the moderates, and thereby have their voices take precedence over the hardliners gradually. And that occurs only when we integrate that with the civil society and the women's groups and the youth groups which are working in that country. So when you look at the security, I think we need to look at providing assistance as and when they ask, but also seeing that the former ANDSF, that is Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, are integrated in some way. I think there are some examples which we could take from Nepal of how that reintegration occurred, and whether it worked or not. I think that's area where we need to look at a little carefully. Second is in terms of the politics, which is again very important, and I talked about inclusion. So we need to look at how we build that inclusive model. And I think you have to tell the Taliban that whatever you achieve has to have the trust of the Afghan people and the legitimacy of the Afghan people. And gradually over time, there might be changes, not immediately, but over time, of having that kind of a nationalist agenda and remaining inside the borders. And more importantly, I think our aid should be developed in helping the Afghans being independent, and being independent in terms of the economics. It's been an aid-dependent country. It's been a rentier country, dependent on decades for aid and not having its own revenue. And a country without its own revenue cannot sustain itself. And we also have issues of the drugs, which are growing exponentially and creating problems for everybody. And the conflict economy will be very difficult to break. So I think we need to look at the economics part of it very carefully, of how do we build those alternate livelihood programs for these people who are there, who don't have any sources of revenue and sources to sustain themselves. And lastly, I think we also need to link our aid with the regional frameworks. There is this Heart of Asia group, which is still existing and doing a lot of conferences. So beyond conferences, I think we need to get on the ground And that's when I think I would like to contribute in the sense of looking at those kind of organizations which are led by the Afghans, owned by the Afghans, and have certain stakes in rebuilding that country and giving it a different future than what it is today. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Manoharan, would you like to take the question about is India trusted?
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you. There are two-part answer to that. One is we must acknowledge that all of our neighbors desperately, if not desperately, they need India's development assistance in every manner, in all the 5 pillars. This is the first aspect. The second aspect is it depends on how they view, depends on the politics in each of the neighboring countries. Either that be Bangladesh or Nepal or Maldives, Sri Lanka, it doesn't matter. I'm not including Afghanistan here. It depends on which political party, which regime. This is how it is. So this is how I simply put it. Thank you, sir.
Professor Sarkar?
Yes,
The two
I
questions.
don't know how I will, whether I can do justice or not. I haven't focused particularly on the ports and the regions per se in my presentation, but let me just comment in general. For example, with regard to the ports and the land customs stations, with the development, with the gradual modification of the land customs section, stations into integrated checkposts. For example, Venapol, Petrapol, and that includes also the port checkposts near Ashuganj and other elsewhere. The trade figures have increased. So it has the prospect in that section. So, and with regard to Chittagong, with regard to development cooperation, Bangladesh is very crucial. For example, from the BCIM corridor and a part of the One Belt, One Road policy, that roadway is also a part of that is going to benefit Bangladesh and India significantly. So if, development cooperation with regard to Bangladesh, India and Bangladesh, that will be is significantly connected with all the broader policies of One Belt, One Road of China, the BCIM corridor, the sub-national level of cooperation, and so on. So be it the opening up of the Chittagong port, be it the, opening and upgrading the border checkposts, that is going to, I think, improve the trade figures significantly. So that is something that overall that I can comment as of now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And dear panelists and friends, I think this has really been a fascinating session. And I don't really think I can summarize all the important points that have been made, except to say that A, human-centric development, B, a nuanced policy. Every country is special, every country is different. And though the third element we didn't discuss was that, as the countries develop, more opportunities open up. And naturally, our own development partnership programs have to factor this in their conception and in their design. So once again, thank you very much to DG ICWA for holding this very important seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray, and the speakers for sharing your valuable views. With this, we come to the end of the 2 parts of the first session.